Okay, we're going to go ahead and start. So I want to thank you all for being here. My name is Jean Allman, and I direct the Washington University Center for the Humanities. I want to welcome all of you to Umrath Lounge, and I also want to welcome those of you who are tuning in from your offices, living rooms, kitchens, or wherever you may be. And I think we have over 160, 180 people who are watching virtually. So, but it's so wonderful to see people in 3 dimensions. It's just great. So thank you. So it is my great honor and privilege on behalf of the Center to welcome you to the 10th Annual McLeod Memorial Lecture on Higher Education. Before beginning, I want to express my gratitude to all of you who have made this hybrid event possible. We finally got the hang of Zoom just when we had to go back to hybrid, but we're hanging in there. I want to thank the amazing staff at the center, particularly in this case, Kathleen Fields, Alicia Dean, and my associate director, Ignacio Infante, for helping to figure out how to make this work. A special thanks to IT, to Media Services, for working through the technology, and finally to Arts and Sciences, which has supported this event in so many ways over these 10 years. For those of us at the center, this lecture is always a highlight of the year, an event we look forward to with great anticipation, but probably never more so than this year. Not only because it is the 10th anniversary of the series, but also because our featured speaker today, more about him in a moment, is the founding director of the center. So in many ways, this is a special year, a kind of confluence, having our annual celebration of Dean James McLeod keynoted by someone who has also had a profound impact. It's hard to breathe. If I pass out, just pick me up and I'll keep going. Keynoted by someone who has also had a profound impact on higher education at this university. In fact, by the director who inaugurated this series 10 years ago in memory of Dean James McLeod, Professor Gerald Earley. 10 years ago, if your hair is the color of mine, doesn't seem very long ago. I suppose the older you get, the shorter the decades seem to become. And I realized that this week that there were many, maybe in this room or attending virtually, who never met Dean McLeod. So I spent some time this past week revisiting the remembrances that were generated a decade ago, many from the students who knew him as Irvin scholars. Those remembrances were so heartwarming, a true affirmation, a reminder of how a single person can make such a monumental difference in the lives of so many people. Dean McLeod, as many of you remember, pledged to know every student by name, face, and story, and he did just that. That being known, being seen, is embedded in every remembrance of students that I read over the past week. Christina Williams, who graduated in 2011, remembered, from the moment you walked on campus, he knew all of our names, where we were from, and our background stories. Urban scholar and 2000 graduate Dr. Courtney Crawford remembered, when you talk about changing lives and making dreams come true, that's what Jim McLeod embodied. He was truly a man whose walk was consistent with every word. Jerome Strickland, who graduated in 2000, remember, Dean McLeod was like having an ever-present moral and intellectual compass. He made us feel as though we were the most important people on the planet. He added, he was also just like Samson. I think his power was in his hair. His afro was legendary. But my most favorite from these 2011 remembrances was from Irvin scholar and 96 graduate Charles Brown Jr. What we learned from him was how to be, and I'm going to just put this up on my refrigerator, the most important person in the room by being the most humble person in the room. And that's like my sort of memory of Dean McLeod. Professor Gerald Earley, the Merle Kling Professor of Modern Letters and our distinguished speaker today, said in 2011, for those of us at Washington Universities whose memories go back 25 years or more, Jim McLeod was the cornerstone upon which this school is built. It is that, quote, man of wisdom, compassion, and steadfast loyalty to the university, as Chancellor Wrighton described him, who we remember and whom we celebrate today. And there is no one better to lead us in that remembering and in that celebration than my colleague in African and African American Studies, Professor Gerald Earley. Professor Earley has been at Washington University since 1982, and like the man about whom he will shortly speak, has during those decades profoundly shaped this university, pushing it to be its better self. He has been an extraordinary institution builder and a leader. He directed the program of American Culture Studies for 6 years in a really critical time in the early 90s. He directed the program in African American Studies for 7 years. In January of 2001, he took on the directorship of the International Writers Center, and through careful consultation with humanities colleagues across the country, built that out into the Center for the Humanities, where he served as founding director for nearly a decade. Most recently, he returned to AFAS, as many of you know, but with the mission of transforming the program into a department, something that was long overdue. Professor Earley succeeded in that mission in fall 2016. That new department is absolutely flourishing, and I am so proud to call it my academic home. Professor Earley has always understood that foundations matter. In each of these important administrative roles, he has carefully and painstakingly, brick by brick, laid a solid institutional foundation. Those who've had the privilege of following after him, myself at the center, Professor Shanti Parikh in AFAS, the department, knows this all too well. We stepped up, we stepped in, and the foundation that he had so meticulously laid has held firm. And of course, most recently on the institutional front, Professor Earley, beginning in 2013, launched The Common Reader, a fantastic public-facing journal of timely essays and reviews, which honestly has no peer or rival at any university in the country. Now, I want to highlight these leadership roles, because today is a day to focus on higher education and how we make change. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out that during these very same years that he did so much to strengthen Black studies at Washington University and to shine the spotlight on the humanities in ways that it had never shown before, Professor Earley was publishing widely monographs, edited collections, essays, poetry, chapters, news pieces. If I named just the books, we'd be here until the 10 o'clock news. He's especially noted for his writings on American culture, with jazz featuring heavily, on sports, boxing, prize fighting, baseball. Many of his publications have garnered awards, again, too long of a list, but I'll mention The Culture of Bruising, Essays on Prize Fighting Literature and Modern American Culture, for which he won the National Book Critics Circle Award. He has twice been nominated for the Grammy Award for Best Album Notes. I don't even know how you do that, but that's amazing. On the local front, you might recall that in 2013, Professor Earley was inducted into the St. Louis Walk of Fame. Nationally, he's the 2006 recipient of the Phi Beta Kappa Evelyn and William Jaffe Medal for Distinguished Service to the Humanities. And way back in 1997, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And of course, just in these past weeks, if you're like me, I'm sure you've enjoyed Professor Earley's commentary on Ken Burns's PBS series on Muhammad Ali, which is really quite an extraordinary series. It is the 5th Burns series in which he's appeared. I could go on, but happily for you, I won't. There's simply no way for me to capture in a short introduction the breadth and depth of my colleague's career, much less the immeasurable ways he has shaped this university and made it a much better place for so many. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gerald Earley to the podium for the 10th annual James E. McLeod Memorial Lecture, Remembering James McLeod and the Rise of Black Studies at Washington University.
Thank you, Jean, for that very, very generous introduction. I'm almost scared to give a talk now after that. Wow. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. It's especially important to me to have so many people come out to hear what I have to say about Jim McLeod and about Black studies at Washington University. I hope I can talk with, boy, this is a challenge. I'll pull it down for a little bit. Oh, woo! Freedom. Let me just say one other thing before I start, and that is I want to tell you what this is not. Okay, this is not a speech. Okay, so it's not like it has applause lines in it, and places where you're supposed to nod your head. It's not a speech. It is not an academic paper. So I'm not here to show you how smart I am. Now, there are people at this university who are very smart, and they're very good at doing that sort of thing. I'm not one of those people, so this is not an academic paper. Okay. This is a story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has characters in it. And you'll be able to follow this story because it's in 3 parts. The first part is the beginning, the second part is the middle, and the third part is the end. So you won't have any problem whatsoever, okay? So with that all said, let's begin. The first part of this is called As It Was in the Beginning. Robert Williams, the first director of Black Studies at Washington University, seemed the ideal person for the job. That is, he embodied the change taking place among Black people at that moment. After all, the Association of Black Collegians, who organized the sit-in at Brookings Hall in December 1968, did not want simply any Black academic to run the Black Studies program. That was the primary demand of their manifesto. It had to be a person who understood why the demand was made and what a Black Studies program was supposed to accomplish. Williams called April 4th, 1968, the day Martin Luther King was assassinated, quote, the precipitating event, unquote. At the time, he was living in San Francisco and working for the National Institute of Mental Health. He was, by his own account, highly successful. Quote, 38 years old and in excellent health, married for 20 years, father of 8 children, property owner, holder of 3 educational degrees, one from Philander Smith, a master's from Wayne State University, and a doctorate in clinical psychology from Washington University, and earning over $20,000 a year, a lot of money at that time. I was, however, an individualist, still a Negro. I spoke standard English, tried desperately not to split a verb, taught my children proper grammar, and corrected them so that they would never split an infinitive. I lived in the best neighborhoods. I was the first to integrate the community, and my children attended the best schools. But these first and best did not instill in me a sense of Black pride. In fact, they created internal conflicts, unquote. Then he adopted the, quote, natural hairstyle, unquote, and he grew a beard. He read all the Black books he could get his hands on. He left the National Institute of Mental Health. In September 1968, he helped to form the Association of Black Psychologists. He became a Black psychologist instead of a clinical psychologist, hanging out with other Black psychologists. Quote, in our meetings, we were doing things in a natural way for me, unquote. He liked the change he was experiencing. In late 1969, he wrote an article where he introduced his bitch test, which stands for Black Intelligence Test of Cultural Homogeneity. He used the word bitch in the sense of complaining about something. In other words, as a synonym for protest. Fighting standardized intelligence and psychological testing became his mission. Quote, since I had almost been a testing casualty, this was the perfect cause for me. I had already been miscounseled in 1945 by a white counselor in Little Rock, the one who told me that I had an IQ of 82 and not to go to college, unquote. Clearly, Williams was hired to become the first director of the Black Studies program here because, having earned his PhD at Washington U, people here knew him. However much he may have changed, there had to be a level of confidence in his competence and his skill as an academic. Moreover, he was tenurable, something he rightly insisted he wanted before he would take the job. But the change Williams was experiencing meant that he was an emblem of the redefinition that black people were undergoing, that the demand for black studies at the white university was meant to further. Williams has strenuously, heroically recreated himself through an act of political consciousness and political will. He had ceased being a Negro and had become a black person. The change was psychological even more than it was political, or let us say, for black people at the end of the 1960s, the political was the psychological, or the psychological was the political. The idea was to free oneself from what white people thought you were and from what white people wanted or expected you to be. No black skin, white mask. It was the era of the natural hairstyle. Black is beautiful. Black power and self-determination for black communities. Anti-colonialism, dashikis, blaxploitation movies where the white man got his just desserts. Kwanzaa and the Kawaii, or Black Value System, were created in the mid-1960s. It is hardly surprising that Williams' Black Psychology course was by far the most popular that Black Studies would ever offer. The fact that demand for Black Studies was led by Black students is also key. Remember that the 1968 Olympic boycott movement was mostly made up of black college students who constitute the majority of black amateur athletes. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was one of the major civil rights organizations of the 1960s and eventually became one of the most radical. It was Stokely Carmichael, the chairman of that group at that time, who sent out the call to black college students to form black student unions on their college campuses, such as the one at Washington University that took over Brookings and demanded a Black Studies program. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale began their organizing for black self-defense in Oakland with black college students. Black students at HBCUs led the sit-in movement in 1960. But even earlier, black students had organized in the 1920s and 30s to replace paternalistic, infantilizing white HBCU presidents with blacks. Williams' transformation matched the temper of black students of the moment. For Williams' transformation was not just about the creation of a new identity or about the visibility of blackness, nor was it devoted solely to making legible an overdue conversion experience. It was about decentering the claims of whiteness in the world as the normal state of the world. As Albert Murray wrote in the late 1960s, black students, quote, expect to find in the courses they are demanding historical clues to the pathological condition of white Americans, unquote. The Black Studies movement was about making the pathology of whiteness visible and legible. It was about exposing not just the history of the miseducation of blacks, but exposing and correcting the miseducation of America itself. In the history of black Americans, Black Studies programs were not a goal as such, as much as they were part of a process. One of many cloths being used to clean a mirror or a window. Black Studies was about getting nearer to the truth by unsettling previous claims to the truth. Black Studies was meant to blow up the world as we knew it. Alas, establishing a Black Studies program did not end the problem of blacks on the Washington University campus, although it may have ameliorated some of them. But it did make the nature of these problems clearer. Part 2 is now and ever shall be. In a memorandum sent to Chancellor William Danforth, dated April 26, 1973, Robert Williams, the director of the Black Studies program, requested that the program, then 3 years old, be made a department. He wrote, in part, recently, quote, recently, we had a problem which brought this issue of departmental status to the surface even more so. We were looking for a faculty person in literature. We had located a person who was interested in coming to the university on a joint appointment basis. When this issue was discussed with the English department, the departmental chairman was quite negative and unreceptive to the notion of a joint appointment. His decision virtually eliminated our opportunity to attract that particular individual. Not only were we having difficulty in recruiting because of the tenure issue, we also faced the possibility of not ever being able to obtain tenure for a person in literature. The English department claimed that it was at a ceiling with 20 tenured members in that department, and that they have called a moratorium on future tenure appointments. Thus, we cannot successfully recruit a top quality person for two reasons. A, because of disagreement in perceptions of what constitutes quality black people, and B, the nature of the matter of tenure, unquote. The memo reveals that there were serious concerns within the Black Studies program of being able to retain the faculty it wanted. If Black Studies could not create tenure dossiers to justify the scholarship of the people it hired, and if other departments would not partner with it in supporting its efforts to hire faculty, how could it exist? It may very well be argued by university administrators that Black Studies was structured exactly like any other area studies program at the university. What Black Studies argued was that it had to be an exception to that structure because it was Black Studies, because of how it came into existence, because of its mission to correct the institutional racism of the university. The university was giving every indication that it did not trust the judgments of Black Studies and in fact was wary of Black Studies' mission. Many whites at the university at this time did not think of Black Studies as an academic field, but rather as a problem eliminator, something that was good for race relations, or even worse, a kind of academic racial cult where black people hang out and ruminate on the mysteries and injustices of being black. So the Black Studies program had an uneasy relationship with the university that created it, but the relationship was remarkably civil. A tenure-track appointment in literature in the Black Studies program would finally be made in January 1982, when I was hired, 9 years after Williams wrote his memo and was no longer the director. It was not a joint appointment. I was solely in Black Studies. My presence did not solve any problems for Black Studies. It can be said that my presence did ultimately resolve an issue, but not in Black Studies' favor. It is commonly asked of applicants during a job interview why they want the job. I answered that I had always wanted to work in a Black Studies program. That was not exactly true. I was willing to work in a Black Studies program, but had not aspired to do so. I wanted the job for a practical, prosaic reason. It started in January 1982 and not the following fall. My youngest daughter had been born on Thanksgiving Day, 1981, a few weeks after my interview here at Washington University. My health insurance only covered part of the cost of her birth. I needed a job in a hurry. I could no longer survive on a stipend. I could not afford to go to the Modern Language Association convention, which is where all English graduates like myself lined up for job interviews. The literature job in Black Studies was a godsend for me. I was terribly afraid I would not get it, the job, because my training was insufficiently steeped in Black Studies. As alas, the old saying is true, sometimes it is better to be lucky than good. I was lucky. You was good too. I knew nothing about tenure except it was something I was supposed to get if I was good enough after a probationary period of 5 years. I did learn soon after I arrived at Washington University that no one in Black Studies had gotten it, that is, gotten promoted with tenure. The Dean of Arts and Sciences told me that a special committee would be appointed when my turn for tenure arrived, made up of people in Black Studies and the English department. As I thought about this, I was puzzled. Only tenured people could pass judgment on whether someone could be promoted with tenure. The only person I knew who was tenured in Black Studies was Robert Williams, a psychologist, not a literature person. Having people in the English department judge me was fine. except I had no joint appointment in the English department. I was 100% in Black Studies. Why should people in the English department judge whether I should be tenured in a Black Studies program? If I had to please the English department, shouldn't I be in the English department in some form or fashion? The dean informed me that Black Studies was considered an area studies program, and this is why someone could be solely appointed in it. But it was not a department, so it could not preside over my tenure case. As I mentioned above, I did not solve any problems for Black Studies when I was hired. I seem only to have encountered a few for myself. I chose not to think about any of this for two reasons. One, I did not think I would be working at Washington University when it was time for me to come up for tenure. And two, I thought no one thought I stood any chance of getting tenured because no one appointed in Black Studies had been tenured. Why worry about something that you are not going to get? Clyde Ruffin, the theater professor for Black Studies, was denied tenure shortly after I arrived. He did not produce enough scholarship, so the Dean's Committee on Promotions gave him the axe. But it seemed that Black Studies was not particularly interested in someone having this position who wrote scholarship, preferring someone who did productions. I'm not sure where performing arts stood on this matter, but it too was a program then, and jointly presented the case with Black Studies. There seemed to be such miscommunication or misunderstanding here about expectations concerning Ruffin that there was no chance of his being tenured no matter how brilliant a director he may have been. Black Studies faculty were upset with this decision, for they felt that they were being denied the right to define their own pedagogical and programmatic needs. This is where and when I entered the program. The director of Black Studies when I arrived was an assistant professor named Gerald Patton. I did not think he could mentor me much as we were both assistant professors. We were both in the same boat. He was just a few years ahead of me. In a couple of years, he too would be denied tenure. He even wrote a book called War and Race, The Black Officer in the American Military, 1915 to 1941, that was published in 1981. I read his book to learn how to get tenure in Black Studies, since everyone said I had to write one, as that was the trick. The title had a colon. That seemed legit for an academic book. It had copious footnotes. That seemed legit for an academic book. It was on a specialized topic of interest to a small number of people. That seemed legit for an academic book. It had all the trappings of what I was supposed to do, and it seemed to have some questions it seemed to have added some questions to the debate about blacks in the military. What more was an academic book supposed to do? But I learned from his example that writing a book was no academic equivalent to a magic bullet for getting tenure. To paraphrase a movie title, publishing scholars also die, especially if they are in Black Studies. Patton's biggest impact on the program was that, with the faculty's approval, he changed the name of it from Black Studies to African and Afro-American Studies in 1985 to emphasize our new diasporic reach with the hire of the African historian Michael Gomez, who would become the director after Patton's departure. He would not be tenured here either. The name change was not insignificant. Black Studies was now known as AFAS, and it was important at the time to claim specific fields rather than a race or the ideological state of a race. It was part of the sea change that was to hit Black Studies nationally in the 1980s, when the quest for respectability and mainstream acceptance clashed with a desire to move further away from Western models of scholarly validation. The two professors I knew best, Robert Watson, who taught the popular Intro to Black Studies, and Robert Johnson, a sociology professor who had been a student here and helped to write the Black Manifesto of 1968 that led to the formation of Black Studies, were both denied tenure. Their denials were a big issue with Black students and were mentioned in the Black Manifesto of 1983. Indeed, of the 8 listed concerns of the 1983 manifesto, the first 4 were directly related to the Black Studies program, including a demand that it be made a department, 10 years after Williams' initial demand for departmental status. I told Rob Johnson that I was not much interested in turning my long, dumb, boring dissertation into a slightly less long, slightly less dumb, slightly less boring book. I told him I wanted to write essays, nothing else. He encouraged me, telling me I would feel better if I was denied tenure having done what I wanted instead of what I thought would please other people, but not myself. That was a comfort to know. What did I have to lose? Johnson also told me never to win a teaching award. No black person winning a teaching award was ever taken seriously as a scholar, he said. It was also something of a comfort to know that when I got bounced, I would at least be in good company, upholding a tradition of sorts. So many people were tossed. Why not me? By the mid-1980s, I believe most people thought that the Black Studies program would be closed. How could it be otherwise when no one connected with it was being tenured? How could it maintain itself as a major? I met James McLeod for the second time when he accompanied Chancellor Danforth on his annual visit to the Black Studies offices. I doubt if the Chancellor annually visited every academic unit of the university, but I suppose Black Studies required his special attention. The visits were pleasant. The Chancellor seemed interested and concerned. James McLeod seemed a nice man. I first met James at the job talk I gave in November 1981. I was not sure why he came to the job talk. He was not in Black Studies. He was, or had been, an assistant professor in the German department. It was a long, dumb, and boring talk. He was kind about it. Indeed, he seemed even impressed. He came to all my long, dumb, boring talks during my early years here. I thought he was a glutton for punishment. He was courtly in a way that certain educated Southern black men are. He seemed to think I had possibilities. He was assistant to the chancellor at the time, and I was impressed with his possibilities as well. As time passed, I thought of him more and more as the university's version of Daniel. I thought James could not only interpret the dreams of the people in Brookings, but that he could actually tell them what they had dreamed. Like Daniel was always true to himself as a Jew, James always seemed true to himself as a black person, even as he worked among the whites, even though he did nothing that drew attention to the fact that he was black. I was impressed by this because it is so difficult to do. One can be loyal to many things serially that seem to be antagonistic to each other. But it is quite an act of the imagination, a real act of ingenuity, to be loyal to many things simultaneously that are antagonistic to each other. He had the uncanny ability to make antagonistic interests lie down together like lambs and lions do in heaven. He was the type of black person who is called a bridge. There is a line in a Bill Withers song that goes, "The most you can ever do is the best you can." It was an expression I sometimes heard as a child among the older black people I was around. It was an ironical expression that told you to know your limits, but to exceed them as a moral imperative. I would see James on campus every now and again and think of that expression. I did not see James very often on campus as he was an administrator working in Brookings and I was a faculty member teaching classes and trying to write essays. Two things would happen to change that. First, after returning from a 2-year postdoctoral leave, a new dean of the faculty changed my appointment so that I was now in the English department officially and was only secondarily in Black Studies, or AFAS, as it had become. I had to struggle to stay connected to AFAS. Second, James McLeod would become the director of AFAS in 1987. Part 3, World Without End. There is something important to understand about Black Studies. First, blacks studied themselves before Black Studies emerged at the white university. Black Americans wrote histories of themselves, wrote accounts of Africa and Haiti as far back as the late 18th century and early 19th centuries. Second, there was a well-established field called Negro Studies that included such well-known people as W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, Alain Locke, Abram Harris, Ralph Bunche, John Hope Franklin, Arturo Schomburg, and many others. In fact, without these earlier scholars, both amateur and professional, Black studies could never have come into existence. Despite the fact that some associated with Black studies, such as Malala Karenga, repudiated Negro studies as insufficiently revolutionary, insufficiently Black nationalist, and insufficiently Marxist, Negro studies existed under more trying circumstances than Black studies ever did. It was virtually the only field that Blacks could establish themselves in as scholars. It was the only place where Blacks were not viciously assaulted and insulted by white scholars. It was a safe space, to use a current expression. It was not Black studies at the white university demanded by Blacks for the same reason, as a safe space. In the age of segregation, as John Hope Franklin pointed out, it was difficult for Negro scholars to get lunch, let alone access archives, especially in the South. Negro studies was heroic work. Didn't those Negro scholars have heavy teaching loads at Negro colleges and far less time to be scholars? Didn't these Negro scholars have far less access to grants and university research funds than their white counterparts? But as John Hope Franklin argued, because, quote, many of the whites conceded that Negroes have peculiar talents that fitted them to study themselves and their problems, unquote, Negro studies became another form of Jim Crowism. Negroes were now relegated to the study of themselves. Then, by the late 1960s, Negro studies was replaced by Black studies. Was Black studies a form of empowerment or a form of marginalization? Was it liberation from Eurocentrism or an ethnic trap? Did Black studies supersede Negro studies or merely reinvent it? In either case, weren't Black and Negro scholars driven to come to the defense of their race? Black people and Negroes have something to say to each other. After all, as I told my daughters, all those Black people who emerged in the 1960s were the sons and daughters of Negroes. When James McLeod became the director of AFAS, there was a feeling in some quarters that the program was going to be shut down. No one associated with it had been promoted with tenure, and the loss of faculty was beginning to grind down morale. The junior faculty like me who were left had been farmed out to established departments and told to make the grade there. I felt as if AFAS was being abandoned. In fact, the dispersal of the few junior faculty who were left convinced me that AFAS was not long for this world. There was the smell of dysfunction and demise about the whole enterprise. Moreover, although this was not the first time a full-time administrator was placed in charge of the program, James was not even in the field of Black studies. This felt like a long goodbye. So I asked James outright if he was overseeing the end of the program. It was naive that I expected an honest answer from an administrator, but James struck me as a man of integrity. I knew he would tell me the truth. He was, after all, Washington University's version of Daniel. He told me that he was not there to shut down the program, and that he would never have taken the job if he had been asked to do so. I believed him. He also told me that he thought I was essential to the future of AFAS, and he wanted to do everything he could to support me. I did not think I had much of a future at Washington University, let alone in AFAS. I thought he was simply being nice. I was wrong. James became Santa Claus for me. Any day I wanted could be Christmas. If I wanted some newfangled computer, it was mine. If I wanted to do a conference, there was money for it, no concern about cost. If I wanted to travel somewhere for some reason, there was money for it. I could do whatever I wanted, could ask for whatever I wanted. I once had the perverse thought that if I wanted to take over the AFAS office next to mine, that James would have had the adjoining wall knocked down, kicked my neighbor out, and given me both offices. Anything that supported my work, my mere presence as a professor, was mine for the asking. I understood that James was doing this in part to maintain my allegiance to the program, as there were so few tenured stream faculty left in AFAS. But also he wanted to show that he personally was invested in my success, that he believed in my possibilities. I cannot tell you how much that meant to me. Here was someone who was looking out for me. When you are a junior person, that means the world to you. But how James treated me was irrelevant to his effect on AFAS on the whole. Because James was not in the field, he had no ideological stakes in it. Canon building versus canons are elitist and oppressive. Black womanism and queer transformation of black culture versus save the black man and the black boy. African diasporic and Afrocentricity theories versus anti-essentialism and cultural pluralism. James was indifferent to all that. This turned out to be good for the program because he did not try to bend its identity in a certain way. At the time, I don't think the program would have profited from such an effort. In this way, he gave a beleaguered program breathing room. We junior people could think about tenure and not about which side we were on in a faculty meeting. In fact, James hardly ever held a faculty meeting. It was a relief because for James, everything had value. James was on everyone's side. For him, Black Studies was capacious. It contained multitudes. It was bigger than the sum of its disagreements. James constantly preached that AFAS was for everyone, and we attracted a more motley collection of students under James than we had before. He did not see it as an academic unit or a listing of courses or even a major, but rather as an experience, as much for the faculty as it was for the students. During those years under James' leadership, AFAS felt like an experiment. Try something, he seemed to say to us. It might work. And if it doesn't work, the failure will be good for you, because black people ought not to fear and knuckle under the failure. James taught us all something important, crucially important in those years. Do not fear the program's uncertainty. Rather, embrace it as a way for you to grow, as a way for you to get nearer to something. Being black itself is the act of wrenching assurance from uncertainty. James talked to students, met with them incessantly. AFAS was always a student-friendly place, but James took it to another level. Our relationship with Student Educational Services, which provided academic support largely for black students, was strong, but during James' term of leadership, it seemed closer than ever. At times, I felt we were a branch of SES. I was not sure if I liked this, but James felt we had to show complete commitment to our students. And so we did. Students come to us for something they cannot get from other units, he would say. We should give them what they seek and what they need. Robert Williams understood from the outset that Black Studies was not merely about training the minds of students. It was about winning the hearts and minds of students. James saw this too. After all, protesting students were the reason we existed at all. And the presence of their pressure, of their manifestos, was one of the reasons why we continued to exist. It was not that James reinvented Black Studies or AFAS. He simply reinforced its virtues and its strengths. He reminded us of what we were good at and that we made the university a better place. During one of my moments of self-doubt, he told me, "You're as good as the best thing you've ever done." I guess he told all of us that in one way or another. And many of us, maybe the best thing we had ever done was teach in a Black Studies program. The entire constellation of changes James had a hand in during his career. The Irvin Scholars Program, the Mellon Mays Program, the acquisition of the Henry Hampton Film Archive, the restructuring of university advising, expanding study abroad, establishing resident faculty fellows. I would like to think that his experience as director of AFAS inspired these accomplishments. Certainly, what he accomplished stabilized the program. What he accomplished stabilized the program. And as the administrator, he helped to enrich AFAS far more than any single director could have done, no matter how good some of these directors were, and several of them were incredibly good. The conflict between university administration and AFAS was that the university's primary concern was respectability. AFAS's primary concern was agency and autonomy. For the university, respectability was the goal for AFAS. For AFAS, respectability was a disagreeable but necessary tactic, never a goal. The bridge between these antagonistic views was James McLeod. The last time I saw James, a few weeks before he died, we chatted a bit on a hot afternoon. I knew he was terminally ill, but I asked him how he was, then regretted it as soon as I asked. He said something to the effect of feeling right with God, with his Savior. I was surprised because during all the years I had known him, he never spoke of God or said anything religious to me. He didn't seem to mind that I asked how he felt. We spoke a little more and then parted. Still, all my songs shall be, nearer my God to thee. That's a good hymn for a dying person to think of, or for a person who is not dying to think about with the dying. There are three things I learned from James McLeod. First, that it is important to listen to people, particularly people you do not want to listen to. Listening is a demonstration of patience and a show of regard for another person. It is also a demonstration of resolve. It is a sign of strength, not weakness. Second, I learned that reaching the goal is less important than how well it is sought. That is the key. One had to be guided by the idea of getting nearer the goal, but also in how well and how much integrity one can have in pursuing the goal. For James, understanding a goal and re-understanding it was, in a sense, the way to achieve it. Excuse me, I got it. It's getting a little dry up here. Thank you. The third thing I learned from James was that Bill Withers and the older black adults who were around me when I was a child were right. The most you can ever do is the best you can. And the most that you ought to do is the best you can. Here endeth the lesson.
Gerald, thank you for that. I feel like every entering class, AFAS across the board, this should be required viewing. So thank you. I don't know, what to say about this question thing. I asked him, should we have questions and answers? And we could do that. I don't know how people are feeling about that, so I'll just, we could put some ideas out on the floor if people are interested. Otherwise, we have some reception outside. We could do this more informally. But if you'd like to share something, or you have a question, we certainly have time for a few thoughts.
I just want to say to all of you, thank you so much for coming. I know James would be so humbled in seeing you here. He loved the Washington University community, and he especially loved working with Gerald in the African American Studies department. I could tell him some stories about that. I do think that one of the things that he wanted for everybody here was to be a community that understood their successes and failures, but if we learn from them, we are all more for the better. I think he tried hard to impress upon everyone he met his love for God, even though he probably did not talk about religion and politics to many people. And I think he would think that the African American Studies program, now being a department, is such a major accomplishment at this university, and that he would hope to see it grow into bigger and better things. Thank you for allowing me to say these few words.
I'm going to let Clara have the last word. Out there are refreshments. They're individually, pandemically packaged. And then we have this big open courtyard, so please grab a snack and Toast Dean McLeod and my colleague Gerald Earley.